Somewhere in an archive right now, rolled up and mislabeled and forgotten, there is almost certainly a map that should not exist. We know this because we keep finding them, and the more carefully we look, the worse the problem gets. Number 24, the Pizzigano Chart, 1424. In 1424, in a workshop in Venice, a cartographer named Zuane Pizzigano finished a navigational chart of the Atlantic. It was a working document, the kind a captain would actually carry, with coastlines, compass roses, and the practical rum lines that let a ship hold a heading across open water. Pizzigano was not a dreamer. He drew what sailors reported, and out in the middle of the empty Atlantic, far west of anything Europe was supposed to know, he drew two enormous rectangular islands and gave them names: Antillia and Satanazes, the island of Satan. Hold the scale of that for a moment. In 1424, the western edge of the European world was the Azores, and even those had barely been touched. Everything past them was, on every other chart of the period, blank, the literal edge of the knowable. Pizzigano drew land out there, 68 years before Columbus sailed. Here is the part that refuses to sit quietly. The name Antillia did not vanish. It migrated forward through a century of cartography, and when Europeans finally reached the Caribbean, those islands were christened the Antilles, after a place that had been drawn on a map before any documented European had seen them. The official explanation is that Antillia is the Isle of Seven Cities, a medieval legend about bishops fleeing the Moorish conquest of Iberia, a pure myth that happened to land near real geography. Coincidence, in other words, a fairy tale that guessed right. But a working navigator does not put fairy tales on a chart a captain will steer by. Pizzigano drew Satanazes with coastline detail, with proportions, with the confidence of a man copying something rather than inventing it. So, which sailors found the Caribbean 70 years early, and why did they come home calling it the Island of Satan? Number 23, the Andrea Bianco Chart, 1448. 24 years after Pizzigano, in 1448, a Venetian sea captain named Andrea Bianco, a man who had actually commanded galleys, not a scholar working from rumor, produced his own atlas of the Atlantic. And in the far southwest of the ocean, well beyond the Azores, Bianco drew a long stretch of coastline and labeled it in his own hand with two words: Isola Authentica, the authentic island, the real one. That word choice is the whole story. A cartographer does not write authentic next to a place he made up. He writes it to distinguish a confirmed landfall from the phantom islands cluttering every other chart of the age. Bianco was drawing a line between the rumors and the thing he believed had actually been seen, and the position he gave it, roughly 1,500 miles southwest of the Cape Verde Islands, lines up with uncomfortable precision against the northeastern shoulder of South America, the bulge of Brazil. Bianco drew it 44 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and 52 years before Pedro Alvarez Cabral officially discovered Brazil in 1500. The standard reading is that Isola Authentica is a misplaced rendering of one of the legendary Atlantic islands, a copying error dressed up with a confident label. But that explanation has to account for the label itself, and it cannot. The accepted history says no European had reached that coast. Bianco, a working captain with his reputation riding on his charts, wrote authentic across it and pointed his finger at South America half a century early. Either he was wrong in the most specific way imaginable, or some sailors already knew, and the age of discovery was only the age of finally admitting it. Number 22, the Catalan Atlas, 1375. Before the impossible maps, look at what a genuinely brilliant one looked like, so you can tell the difference. In 1375, a Jewish master mapmaker on the island of Majorca named Abraham Cresques, a man who also built compasses and clocks and navigational instruments, completed an atlas so magnificent it was sent as a royal gift to Charles V of France. It stretches nearly 10 feet wide across 6 leaves of painted vellum, and it still sits in the National Library in Paris. It carries the first ornate compass rose ever drawn on a map, and it fused two things that had never properly been joined before: the symbolic medieval world picture and the hard navigational accuracy of a working sea chart. Where the Catalan Atlas drew on real knowledge, it is stunning. The Mediterranean is sharp and usable. The coasts of Europe and North Africa are recognizably correct. And deep in West Africa, it shows Mansa Musa, the gold-rich emperor of Mali, seated on his throne holding a nugget of gold, drawn from the genuine trade route reporting of merchants who had actually crossed the Sahara. This is what real, sourced, second-hand knowledge produces, accurate where the information flowed, and confident about it. And here is the lesson hiding in plain sight. Where the information ran out, the Catalan Atlas knows it. Push east into Asia, and the map dissolves into the fantasies of Marco Polo and the invented travels of John Mandeville. Monsters and marvels and guesswork. The line between what Cresques knew and what he was guessing is visible. You can see the edge of his knowledge. The official view is simply that this is the high water mark of medieval European cartography, no mystery at all, and that is exactly why it belongs here. Hold it up as the standard. This is what the best mapmaker in Europe could do in 1375, with the best information, drawing carefully, and honestly admitting where the data stopped. Remember that honesty, because the maps that come later will be accurate in places where the information was not supposed to exist at all, and they will not look like they are guessing. Number 21. The Diverga World Map, 1411 to 1415. Sometime between 1411 and 1415, a Venetian named Albertinus de Verga signed a circular world map with a line of small script. Albertine de Verga made me in Venice. He even wrote the year, except the last digit sits on a fold in the parchment, and the fold wore it away. So the map can only be dated to somewhere in that 4-year window. That worn-off digit is a small thing. It is also, as you will see, almost a metaphor for the whole object. The map itself is a strange hybrid, a medieval circular world image laid over the precise rhumb lines of a working sea chart, centered on a windrose somewhere out near Central Asia. And in its southern and eastern reaches, de Verga drew things he had no business knowing. The coast of southern Africa appears with an outline some researchers say matches reality, drawn more than 70 years before Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Southeast of Asia, he placed a large southern landmass, which some have read as an early echo of a continent below the equator. For a single object, this would be a curiosity. What makes the de Verga map unforgettable is what happened to it. Rediscovered in 1912 in an antiquarian shop, authenticated by a leading cartographic scholar, photographed, catalogued, and then, in 1932, put up for auction. During that auction, it was stolen. It has never been recovered. No museum has it, no vault. We know what the de Verga map looked like only because, before it vanished, someone took photographs. The official position is sober. It is a fine but conventional medieval map of the world, its southern landmass a speculative descendant of Marco Polo's tales, its African coast a lucky byproduct of chart convention rather than secret knowledge. And that may be true, but here is the disquiet at the center of this list. We cannot test it. We cannot put it under a multispectral camera, or analyze its ink, or measure its coastlines against bedrock. The one map that might have settled an argument was carried out of a sale room by a thief and swallowed by the 20th century. How many of the answers we are missing were not lost to time, but simply stolen, and are sitting in a private collection right now, in the dark? Number 20. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, 1300. Now look at the other kind of official map, the one that had nothing to do with sailing at all. Around 1300, in England, someone working under a clergyman named Richard of Haldingham produced the largest medieval map of the world still in existence. It survives at Hereford Cathedral, painted on a single sheet of calfskin more than 5 feet tall, crammed with over 1,000 pictures and captions, and 420 towns. And as a piece of geography, it is almost useless, because geography was never the point. The Hereford map is a circle with Jerusalem nailed to the exact center, because the medieval church placed the holy city at the heart of creation. East is at the top, not north, because east is where the sun rises, and where Christians watched for the return of Christ, who presides over the Last Judgment at the very apex of the map. The Garden of Eden sits at the edge of the world. The British Isles are crammed awkwardly into a bottom corner. The southern margins crawl with monstrous races and cannibals, the creatures medieval Europe believed lived at the rim of the knowable. This is not a map for finding a place. It is a map for finding God. The official explanation is straightforward and entirely correct. It is a work of theology and art, not navigation, a spiritual diagram of a Christian universe, and it was never meant to guide a ship anywhere. And that is precisely why it matters in this list. This was the mainstream worldview. This was what a world map meant to educated Christian Europe around 1300. Jerusalem in the middle, monsters at the edges, Eden over the horizon. Now hold that beside the Catalan Atlas from 75 years later, with its compass rose and its accurate Mediterranean, and you realize there were two cartographic worlds running side by side. One was a theology. The other was a navigational science quietly recording the real shape of coastlines. Keep both of them in mind, because the maps that follow keep showing knowledge that neither of these official traditions was supposed to possess. Number 19. The Behaim Erdapfel, 1492. If Hereford was the official worldview, here is the official knowledge, frozen at the exact moment everything was about to change. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, a merchant and cosmographer named Martin Behaim, working in Nuremberg, completed the oldest surviving terrestrial globe in the world. He called it the Erdapfel, the Earth Apple, and what it shows is how little the establishment actually knew. On Behaim's globe, there is no America. None. Between the western edge of Europe and the eastern shore of Asia, there is nothing but open ocean dotted with imaginary islands. Japan floats more than 1,000 miles from where it should be. The whole Western Hemisphere, 2 continents, an ocean larger than all the land on Earth combined, simply is not there. Because in 1492, the people in charge of knowing did not know. This is the control sample. This is what the best-funded, most up-to-date geographic authority in Europe could produce in the year Columbus weighed anchor. Hold that globe in your mind, because every other map on this list is going to be compared against it. When an Ottoman admiral in 1513, or a French mathematician in 1531, draws a coastline that Behaim, at the very center of European knowledge, could not even guess at, the gap between them is the entire mystery of this video. The official explanation of the Erdapfel is that it is exactly what it appears to be, an honest snapshot of European ignorance, valuable precisely because it is so wrong, and that is the point. The mainstream account of history says human geographic knowledge advanced slowly, painfully, outward from this kind of blankness. Behaim's globe is the proof of that story. So when the maps that come next are more correct than the official globe of their own century, you are left with only 2 options. Either they got lucky in ways that beggar belief, or they were copying from something the establishment had lost. Keep the Earth Apple in your hand. We are about to start filling in the parts it left empty. Number 18. The Kangnido Map, 1402. In 1402, on the other side of the planet from Nuremberg, astronomers and cartographers of Korea's Joseon dynasty completed a world map called the Kangnido. It drew on Chinese and Islamic sources, and most of it is what you would expect. Asia rendered in detail, Korea at the center, Europe small and vague at the western margin. And then there is Africa. Africa, on the Kangnido, is correct. The continent tapers to a point in the south. It has the right proportions, the recognizable triangle that any modern eye reads instantly. This was drawn 95 years before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and proved to Europe that Africa even had a southern tip. In 1402, Korea had no contact with Africa. None. No ships, no trade, no travelers who had been there. And here is where it stops being merely surprising and becomes genuinely strange. The Chinese and Islamic maps the Kangnido supposedly copied from got Africa wrong. They bent it eastward, flattened it, squared it off, drew it as a stub closing off the Indian Ocean. The source material was distorted. The copy is accurate. The Kangnido is more correct than every map it was built from. The official answer is that Korean scholars performed an act of synthesis, assembling fragments of oral testimony from Arab merchants and Silk Road traders, piecing together a puzzle whose individual parts were all broken, but whose final image somehow came out clean. It is a generous explanation, and it asks you to believe that second-hand rumors produced a continent shape that first-hand maps could not. How does a copy come out sharper than its original, unless the true original was something neither we nor the Koreans have ever seen? Number 17. The Tabula Rogeriana, 1154. 2.5 centuries before the Kangnido, the most accurate map of the world was already finished, and we let it disappear. Around 1138, the Norman king Roger II of Sicily commissioned a Muslim geographer named Muhammad al-Idrisi to map the known world. Al-Idrisi did not guess. For roughly 15 years, he interviewed the crews and passengers of ships docking in Sicily, sent agents to far regions to verify, and, in his own description of the method, kept only what multiple independent travelers agreed on, discarding anything contradictory. It was systematic, cross-checked, evidence-based geography, 400 years before the age of discovery. The result was completed in 1154, and its scale is hard to absorb. The master version was engraved onto a single disc of solid silver, roughly 6.5 feet across, and weighing on the order of 300 pounds. Around it, al-Idrisi wrote a book of 70 regional maps with descriptions of climate, cities, distances, and peoples, and his calculation of the Earth's circumference came within about 4% of the true figure. The map was drawn with south at the top, in the Islamic convention, and it remained the most accurate world map in existence for the next 300 years, and then it was destroyed. After Roger's death, Sicily fell into revolt. In the violence, the Latin edition was burned, and the great silver disc, the single most advanced scientific instrument of its age, vanished. Melted down, most likely, for the value of the metal. Al-Idrisi fled to North Africa, carrying the Arabic text, and the knowledge it held passed into the Islamic world, rather than into Europe. The Latin translation that might have guided European navigators did not appear for centuries, long after it could have changed anything. The official explanation here is not a mystery at all. It is a tragedy. The map was real, its loss is documented, and historians agree it was simply a casualty of war. But sit with the implication. The most accurate description of the world for 300 running years existed as a physical object, and it was thrown into a furnace for its silver. We did not fail to make the knowledge. We made it, and then we melted it. If the establishment globe of 1492 was so blank, it was not because the knowledge could not exist. It was because we kept burning it. What else went into the fire that no exile carried out? Number 16. The Haji Ahmed Map, 1559. In 1559, an Ottoman cartographer named Haji Ahmed engraved a world map onto a set of wooden blocks in Venice. Ahmed had never sailed the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire had no Pacific fleet, no Pacific colonies, no presence whatsoever on the far side of the world. And yet the map he produced shows the Pacific coast of the Americas, of Asia, of China, and Japan, with a fidelity the explorers actually sailing those waters had not yet achieved. Think about what the Pacific meant in 1559. Spanish and Portuguese pilots were getting lost in it, dying in it, because nobody could solve the problem of longitude. Without a way to measure how far east or west you were, the entire ocean was a guess, and the guesses killed crews. The longitude problem would not be cracked until John Harrison's marine chronometer in the 1760s, 2 centuries later. Yet the longitude accuracy on Haji Ahmed's map corresponds to that later standard, the precision of the late 1700s, drawn in 1559 by a man at a desk in Venice. The detail that should stop you. The northwestern coast of North America, the rough outline of Alaska, appears on this map 182 years before Vitus Bering officially reached it in 1741. Historians explain this as the fruit of excellent Ottoman intelligence, a compilation stitched from the best European charts circulating along the trade routes, with Ahmed simply assembling fragments others had drawn. And that is plausible, until you remember that the European originals he supposedly copied were themselves wrong about the Pacific. You cannot copy accuracy out of inaccurate sources. The map is better than the things it was allegedly made from. Where did the surplus precision come from? The lost charts of the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, or the Polynesian navigators who had been crossing that ocean for 1,000 years before anyone in Venice picked up a graver. Number 15. The Martellus map, 1491. This is the map that sent Columbus to the wrong continent. Around 1491, a German cartographer working in Florence, Henricus Martellus, drew an enormous world map, roughly 4 feet by 6, the most complete picture of the world a European could buy on the eve of everything. Scholars consider it nearly certain that Christopher Columbus studied this map, or one almost identical to it, before he sailed, and it was wrong in a very specific, very consequential way. It placed Japan about 1,000 miles too far east, out into the open ocean, making the gap between Europe and Asia look crossable. Columbus did not sail west in spite of the maps. He sailed west because of one. He carried Martellus's error across the Atlantic as fact, and when he hit the Caribbean, he believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia, because that is exactly where this map told him Asia would be. The most famous voyage in history was navigated on a mistake drawn in Florence. For 5 centuries, most of the map was unreadable. Its dozens of Latin inscriptions had faded into the background, leaving perhaps the most important map of the 15th century mute. Then, in 2014, a team at Yale photographed it in 12 frequencies of light, several beyond the visible range, and pulled the lost text back out of the parchment with multispectral imaging. What emerged confirmed the map's bloodline. It was a direct source for Martin Behaim's globe, and for the Waldseemüller map that first wrote the word America. 3 of the most important objects in cartographic history, and Martellus sits at the head of the family. The imaging revealed something else. In the South Pacific, roughly where Australia actually lies, Martellus had drawn a large island. The lead scholar calls it a lucky guess, the common mapmaker's horror of empty space, filled in with invention. That is the official explanation, and for a single island it holds. But notice what this map quietly proves, that a single chart, copied and recopied, can steer the course of history, and that the men recopying it often had no idea which lines were knowledge and which were guesses. Columbus bet his life on the difference and got it wrong. How many other guesses on these maps were copied forward by people who never knew they were looking at something real? Number 14. The Cavario Planisphere, 1505. Watch how the secret travels. Around 1505, a Genoese cartographer named Nicolai de Caveri drew a vast world map on 10 joined sheets of parchment, more than 7 feet across, now held in Paris. By itself, it looks like just another beautiful early chart of the new lands. Its importance is what it sits in the middle of. The Cavario Planisphere is a link in a chain, and the chain runs straight from a stolen secret to the most famous map in history. It works like this. A Portuguese state secret leaks out of Lisbon. It reaches Italy. A Genoese hand, Caveri's, copies it and refines it, drawing the Atlantic coasts of North and South America with a precision that startled later scholars. The eastern seaboard of North America, rendered so well that one historian noted it resembles the real coastline from Florida up toward the Hudson, at a time when Europeans are not supposed to have walked those beaches at all. And then Caveri's map becomes the single most important source for Martin Waldseemüller, the man who, 2 years later, will draw the map that names America. The official explanation is reassuringly mundane. This is just how cartography worked. Charts were copied by hand, passed from port to port, each mapmaker improving on the last, and the surprising accuracy of the American coast simply reflects Portuguese voyages we have partial records of, knowledge propagating normally, one workshop to the next. But sit with what that actually means. We can watch a coastline that should not exist yet pass from a stolen original to a Genoese copyist to a German printer, growing more confident at every step, with nobody in the chain quite sure where the first lines came from. That is the real mechanism behind half the maps on this list. Knowledge of impossible accuracy, moving hand to hand through copyists who trusted the source and never asked how the source knew. The secret does not announce itself. It just gets copied until it looks normal. Number 13. The Juan de la Cosa map, 1500. In the year 1500, the man who owned and piloted Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria herself, drew the first surviving map to depict the Americas. His name was Juan de la Cosa, and he had been there. He had crossed the Atlantic with Columbus, stood on the decks, seen the new coastlines with his own eyes. So his map is not a compilation of rumors, it is testimony from a primary witness, and it contains a quiet act of defiance with unsettling implications. On de la Cosa's chart, Cuba is drawn as an island. That sounds trivial until you know what Columbus believed. Christopher Columbus insisted, to the end of his life in 1506, that Cuba was not an island, that it was a peninsula of mainland Asia, the edge of China itself. He believed it so fiercely that in 1494 he forced his entire crew to swear a notarized oath, under threat of having their tongues cut out, that Cuba was attached to the Asian mainland. To say otherwise was a punishable act. And yet, 6 years later, his own pilot, a man who had sworn that oath, quietly drew Cuba as an island, surrounded on all sides by water. De la Cosa knew, somehow, despite Columbus never having sailed around it, despite the official position being mainland, de la Cosa knew Cuba was an island and put it on the map. The mainstream view treats this as de la Cosa simply being a sharper, more honest observer than his admiral. But the knowledge had to come from somewhere, a secret voyage that defied Columbus's orders, or the charts of the indigenous Taino, who had navigated those waters for centuries and knew precisely what was an island and what was not. What did the pilot of the Santa Maria know that the captain of the Santa Maria went to his grave denying? Number 12. The Vinland Map. We are at the exact center of this list, and we are going to stop and ask the question everything else depends on. How do you know any of these maps are real? The answer is this one, and it is the most important map here, because it is the one that turned out to be a lie. For half a century, the Vinland map was the holy grail of pre-Columbian cartography. It surfaced in the 1950s, was dated to around 1440, and appeared to prove that Norse explorers had reached and mapped North America before Columbus was born. It shows Greenland, drawn as an island, with startling accuracy, at a time when Europeans believed Greenland was a peninsula. And to the southwest, it shows a large island labeled Vinland, the coast of North America. Yale acquired it. It was insured for tens of millions. It rewrote textbooks. And it is a fake. In 2021, scientists at Yale ran a full chemical analysis of its ink, and they found titanium, specifically a compound used in a white pigment that was not manufactured until the 1920s. The ink that drew the Vinland map was a 20th century ink. The medieval map was forged within living memory by someone who knew enough history to make it dangerously convincing. This is why the Vinland map matters more than almost any genuine one. Everything you have heard so far, and everything still to come, lives under a single question. How do you know the others are real? The Vinland map is the answer. It is the control case. It proves that science possesses the tools to catch a forgery, to find the one anachronistic atom hiding inside thousands of square inches of convincing parchment, and bring the whole thing down. So when those same techniques are turned on the Piri-Reis map, on Oronce Fine, on the Cantino planisphere, and the ink is right, the parchment is right, the dating holds, and the impossibility survives every test, that is not a mystery you can wave away. The fakes get caught. These didn't. The most ambitious lie in the history of cartography was exposed by a chemist, which means the maps we couldn't break are telling the truth about something we still cannot explain. Number 11. The Zeno map, 1558. If the Vinland map is the lie that science caught, the Zeno map is the lie that fooled the masters for 200 years. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno the Younger published a map and a bundle of letters he claimed to have found in the attic of his family's palazzo. The documents, he said, were the work of his ancestors, two brothers who had supposedly voyaged into the far North Atlantic in the 1390s, a century before Columbus. The map showed Greenland and Iceland with real precision, and a land to the west called Estodiland, described as a place of stone buildings in Latin books, a description that maps almost perfectly onto the Norse settlement at L'Anso Meadows in Newfoundland. So far, this sounds like the Vinland map's twin. But the Zeno map is stranger, because of what it did to everyone else. It contained a large island called Frisland, an island that does not exist. And the Zeno map was considered so authoritative that the giants of European cartography, Mercator and Ortelius among them, copied the phantom Friesland into their own atlases, where it persisted, misleading navigators for the next 200 years. A made-up island became official geography because the right family vouched for it. The mainstream verdict is that Niccolo the Younger fabricated the whole thing to glorify his lineage and steal the discovery of America for Venice, redrawing the accurate Greenland data from charts of his own time. Probably true. And yet the explanation has threads it cannot tie off. Why does the Greenland on the Zeno map exceed the accuracy of the contemporary maps the forger supposedly copied from? Why did the most rigorous cartographers of the age, men who debunked other frauds, accept it without blinking? Was the 1390s voyage entirely invented, or a real Norse crossing wrapped in later embellishment? A lie that fooled Mercator for 2 centuries is resting on at least one truth that nobody has ever located. And from here on, every map we look at has passed the test that the Vinland map failed. Number 10. The Cantino Planisphere, 1502. In 1502, an Italian agent named Alberto Cantino smuggled a map out of Lisbon. He was working for the Duke of Ferrara, and what he stole was a Portuguese master chart, a state secret of the highest order. Portugal guarded its navigational data the way a modern nation guards weapons codes. Revealing it to a foreign power was punishable by death. Cantino got it out anyway, and when King Manuel I of Portugal learned of the theft, he was reportedly furious, not because a pretty picture had been copied, but because the map revealed how much Portugal already knew and was not supposed to know. What it shows is the coastline of Brazil, drawn in detail, running thousands of miles southward, all the way to roughly 35 degrees south latitude. Brazil had been officially discovered by Cabral in the year 1500, 2 years before the map, and according to the surviving record, Portuguese ships had only managed to sail down to about 28 degrees south. So the question carves itself into the parchment. Who mapped the rest? Hundreds of miles of coastline appear on the Cantino map below the furthest point any documented Portuguese expedition had reached, with bays, river mouths, and the genuine shape of a coast that, on paper, no one had yet seen. The official explanation is that Portuguese voyages between 1497 and 1502 were simply more frequent and more far-ranging than the records admit, their results suppressed to keep Spain in the dark. And that is exactly the point that should unsettle you. The defense of the map is itself a confession, that the public record of exploration was deliberately falsified, that the official timeline was a cover story. If the Portuguese were hiding how far south they had gone, then the documents we trust to tell us who discovered what are not history. They are surviving propaganda. This, by the way, is the very chart whose leak we traced 2 maps ago, the secret that Kaveri copied and Waldseemüller printed, a map that one man threatened death to keep secret and another risked death to steal, is not hiding a coincidence. Number 9. The Ribeiro Map, 1529. This is the moment cartography learned to lie with science. In 1529, a Portuguese cartographer working for the Spanish crown, Diogo Ribeiro, produced a world map so advanced it is often called the first scientific map of the world. It was a lavish copy of the Padrón Real, the official, secret master chart kept under guard at the House of Trade in Seville, and copied onto every Spanish ship that sailed. It was the first world map built on real latitude measurements rather than guesswork, the first to show the true, staggering width of the Pacific Ocean. By every technical standard, it is a triumph of evidence over superstition, and it is bent, deliberately. Spain and Portugal had spent decades fighting over a line drawn down the world by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, splitting the globe between them. After Magellan's expedition circled the Earth in 1522, everything came down to one question. On which side of the line did the Moluccas fall? The Spice Islands, the richest real estate on the planet. Ribeiro, paid by Spain, gave his employers the answer they wanted. On his beautifully scientific map, he stretched the width of Africa and the Indian Ocean by something like 14.5 degrees, sliding the Spice Islands just inside the Spanish half of the world. The official explanation is not a cover-up at all, because historians caught it cleanly. This is simply early political geography, a map made to win a treaty, the science genuine, but the dial deliberately turned. The same year it was drawn, Spain sold its claim to the islands to Portugal anyway, in the Treaty of Zaragoza. But hold this one next to everything else on the list. Here is hard proof, fully accepted by mainstream historians, that a state could produce a map dressed in flawless scientific clothing and quietly falsify it for power. If the most advanced map of 1529 was a political instrument, then accuracy on an old map is not innocent. It is a clue. And the question for every other chart here becomes sharper. Not just where did the knowledge come from, but who wanted it shown and who wanted it hidden. Number 8. The Waldseemüller map, 1507. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller printed a world map in the mountains of Lorraine, and on it he did two things. The first made him immortal. He wrote, for the first time anywhere, the word America, naming the new continent after Amerigo Vespucci. The only surviving copy was bought by the United States Library of Congress in 2003 for $10 million, the most ever paid for a single map. The second thing Waldseemüller did is the thing nobody can explain. He drew the Pacific Ocean. He drew a vast, separate body of water lying between the Americas and Asia, a continent-spanning ocean on the far side of the New World. And in 1507, no European had seen it. Vasco Núñez de Balboa would not lay eyes on the Pacific from a peak in Panama until 1513, 6 years later. Ferdinand Magellan would not cross it until 1521, 14 years later. Yet there it is, in the proportions of a real ocean, drawn by a man in landlocked Lorraine before any record says it was found. We even know part of his workbench. He leaned on the Martellus map and on the Cavario planisphere, numbers 15 and 14 on this very list. But neither of those showed an open Pacific the way Waldseemüller drew it. The standard answer is logical extrapolation. If the Earth is a sphere and the new lands are a separate continent, then a second ocean simply must exist between them. Reasonable, except reason alone does not give you proportions, and Waldseemüller's Pacific is not a vague gesture at water should go here. It has shape. And then there is the detail the tidy explanation cannot absorb. In his 1513 edition, Waldseemüller quietly erased the name America and altered the Pacific, as though, in the intervening 6 years, someone had told him he had drawn something he was not supposed to know yet, and instructed him to take it back. Why does a man unlearn the truth and redraw the map smaller, unless the first version showed something he was never meant to show? Number 7. The Fra Mauro map, 1450. Around 1450, on the monastery island of Murano near Venice, a Camaldolese monk named Fra Mauro completed a map more than 6 feet across, a vast circular planisphere, the most detailed world map of its era, commissioned by King Afonso V of Portugal, a nation hungry for any edge in its push down the African coast. Fra Mauro ran a professional workshop. His clients made life and death decisions from his work. This was not the place for fantasy, and he filled it with 3,000 written annotations, citing his sources, including, repeatedly and explicitly, ancient ones. He did 2 radical things. First, he flipped the world, south at the top, north at the bottom, following Islamic convention rather than European habit. Second, and far more dangerous, he drew an open sea route around the southern tip of Africa, 38 years before Bartholomew Diaz officially became the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. And then there is the annotation. In his own hand, Fra Mauro wrote that around the year 1420, a ship, most likely Portuguese, had already sailed around the southern Cape of Africa and passed into the Indian Ocean, 68 years before the man we credit with the achievement. He did not present this as legend. He presented it as fact reported by his sources, naming ancient Arab and Chinese accounts as his authorities. The official explanation is that this is the summit of medieval cartography, a brilliant synthesis of every tradition Venice's trade network could reach, with the Africa annotation chalked up to error or undocumented early Portuguese sailing. But Fra Mauro was specific. He named a date, and when the Portuguese finally did round the Cape in 1488, they reportedly found ancient stone pillars already standing on the coast, markers left by someone who had been there first. Fra Mauro's map carries a quiet, devastating suggestion that what we call the Age of Discovery was really the Age of Rediscovery, Europe not finding the world, but remembering it. So where are the ancient sources a Venetian monk swore he was copying from, and who erased them so completely that only his footnotes remain? Number 6. The Dieppe Maps, Jave le Grand, 1547. Between roughly 1535 and 1562, a school of master cartographers in the French port of Dieppe produced a series of gorgeous, hand-painted world maps for European nobility. They are among the most beautiful charts ever made, and on a run of them, the Catalan Atlas of 1547 the most famous, there is a continent that should not be there. South of Indonesia, where the open ocean ought to be, the Dieppe mapmakers drew a vast landmass and labeled it Jave le Grand, Greater Java. Its coastlines carry French and Portuguese and half-Frenchified Portuguese place names, and generations of researchers have argued that its shape is the shape of Australia, drawn more than 200 years before Captain James Cook charted the East Coast in 1770. The case is genuinely eerie in its detail. Proponents, beginning with the lawyer Kenneth McIntyre and his book, The Secret Discovery of Australia, argue that Portuguese navigators, most likely under Cristóvão de Mendonça, secretly sailed down the Australian coast between roughly 1521 and 1524, and that their charts, smuggled north, became Jave le Grand. They point to a stretch the maps mark as a dangerous coastline near where the Great Barrier Reef actually sits, and to a bay labeled in French with a name meaning the Coast of Grasses, sitting roughly where Botany Bay would later be named, for its grasses, by Cook's botanists. The same intelligence game that produced the stolen Cantino map, they argue, produced this one. The official explanation pushes back hard, and it is the strongest skeptical case on this entire list. Critics, led, ironically, by a scholar who set out to prove the Portuguese theory and ended up demolishing it, point out that there are no surviving Portuguese charts of any such voyage, no logbooks, no records, and that Jave le Grand can be explained as a clumsy reassembly of unscaled charts of Java, fused onto the imaginary southern continent every cartographer of the age expected to find down there. The animals and people painted on it resemble Sumatra, not Australia. It may be a theory wearing the mask of a discovery. So, which is it? The leaked secret of a hidden voyage, or a beautiful accident of wishful geometry? 2 centuries before anyone admits we found Australia, French painters drew it, gave its bays French names, and nobody can prove how they knew. Number 5. The Ibn Benzara Portolan, 1487. In 1487, 5 years before Columbus sailed, a cartographer named Yehudi ibn Benzara drew a navigational chart of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea. It survives in the Vatican Library, and by the ordinary standards of its day, it is simply a superb chart, with accurate coastlines, dense detail, and the fine geometric web of rhumb lines a pilot would steer by. It is the next detail that pulls it out of the ordinary and into the strange, and it was the historian Charles Hapgood, the same researcher who would chase the Piri-Reis map, who first pointed at it. Look at the Aegean on Ibn Benzara's chart, and you find islands. Too many islands, far more than dot that sea today. And the coastlines, and what appear to be glacial features, sit in positions that suggest something uncomfortable. That the chart, or the older source it was copied from, was drawn when the sea level was significantly lower than it is now, when the melting ice caps had not yet flooded the lowlands, and dozens of small islands that are underwater today still stood above the waves. Here is the scale of that claim. The sea has been at roughly its modern level for thousands of years. For the extra islands to be real rather than decorative, the original source map would have to date back to near the end of the last ice age, 10 or 12,000 years ago. A working sea chart, in other words, copied down through an unbroken chain of hands from a civilization that mapped the Aegean before the meltwater came. The official explanation is far simpler and far less thrilling. These charts routinely crowd extra islets and rocks into busy seas as navigational warnings, and the glaciers are an overreading of ordinary coastal markings. The extra islands are clutter, not memory, and that is the responsible position. But Hapgood had now found the same fingerprint twice, an apparently medieval map that seems to preserve a coastline from a world that ended before history began. Once is an anomaly, twice is a pattern, and the pattern is pointing somewhere very specific, because the next three maps all show the same impossible place, and the last one shows it best of all. Number 4. The Buache Map. 1737. In 1737, the first royal geographer of the French Academy of Sciences, Philippe Buache, published a map of the southern polar region. Buache was an establishment scientist at the highest level, not a mystic, not an amateur, a man whose maps were studied by the crowned heads of Europe, and he drew Antarctica, not as a single landmass, but as something far more specific. Two large landmasses, separated by a wide ocean channel running through the middle of the continent. Antarctica would not be officially sighted for another 83 years, in 1820. Its interior would stay a blank far longer. So Buache was not merely drawing a continent before anyone had seen it. He was drawing its internal structure, claiming it was secretly two pieces of land divided by water. And like the others before him, he did not claim to have invented it. He said he had reconstructed it from older sources and earlier voyages whose records he trusted. For 2 centuries, this looked like pure invention. Then, in 1958, 221 years after Buache published, the International Geophysical Year sent teams across Antarctica with seismic sounding gear, firing shock waves down through the ice to map the rock beneath. What they found, under more than a mile of ice, was that the bedrock of West and East Antarctica is genuinely divided. Strip away the ice, let the sea back in, and the continent really would be 2 landmasses split by water, precisely the structure Buache drew. Decades later, modern radar and satellite surveys mapped the entire hidden bedrock of the continent and confirmed it a 3rd time. The dividing channel is real, and much of West Antarctica's floor lies below sea level, exactly as if the water belonged there. The official explanation is the principle of symmetry. Buache reasoned that since the Arctic North is a scatter of channels and islands, the South Pole ought to mirror it, and he simply got lucky. But a lucky guess gives you a guess. It does not give you the correct subglacial channel, in the correct place, 2 centuries before the technology to detect it existed. A coin toss does not land on the exact hidden geometry of a continent no one had seen. He drew the shape of land buried under a mile of ice, that no living person had laid eyes on, that no instrument could reach for another 221 years, and the surveys proved him right. The question is no longer whether he guessed, it is what he was copying, and where that source is now. Number 3. The Mercator Arctic Map, 1569. Gerardus Mercator was not a fringe figure. He was the most important cartographer who ever lived, the man whose map projection still hangs on the wall of nearly every classroom on Earth. He was a meticulous scientist who studied the behavior of compass needles and built his life on precision. So, when Mercator drew the North Pole on an inset of his great world map of 1569, he was not doodling a fantasy. He was solving a problem and reporting what his sources told him. And what he drew is one of the strangest images in the history of cartography. He drew the Arctic free of ice. At the exact center of the pole, he placed an enormous black magnetic mountain, Rupes Nigra, the Black Rock, which he described as roughly 33 miles around, surrounded by a colossal whirlpool where the world's oceans poured inward. From a central polar sea, 4 great rivers flowed outward in symmetrical directions, dividing the surrounding land into 4 islands. And the mountain was not decoration. Mercator was wrestling with why every compass on Earth points north, and his answer was a literal mountain of magnetic stone at the top of the world, pulling the needles toward it. Mercator named his source, a lost book from the 14th century called the Inventio Fortunatae, the Fortunate Discovery, said to have been written by an English friar, an Oxford mathematician, who had supposedly traveled into the far north around 1360. The book no longer exists. Every copy has vanished. Mercator himself only knew it secondhand, through a summary in another lost letter, a copy of a description of a book that no one alive has ever held. And here is the disquieting part. The outlines of Greenland and Iceland on Mercator's Arctic inset are frighteningly accurate for 1569. And 20th century undersea surveys revealed that the floor of the Arctic Ocean genuinely does contain great ridges encircling deep basins, submerged structure, faintly echoing the four-island geometry Mercator drew above the waterline. The official line is that the whole thing is myth. The world pillar, the four rivers of Eden, religious symbolism mistaken for geography. But Mercator was the man who imposed mathematical order on the entire globe. He did not put Eden on his masterpiece by accident, and he cited a real book, by name, that someone allowed to disappear. What did the English friar see at the top of the world, and who needed his book gone so badly that not one page of it survived? Number 2. The Arronce-Finet Map, 1531. In 1531, the royal mathematician to King Francis I of France, Arronce-Finet, a serious scientist who calculated coordinates, designed instruments, and published astronomical tables, drew a world map in an elegant, heart-shaped projection, 2 lobes joined down the middle, and at the bottom of it, centered exactly on the South Pole, he drew an entire continent. Mountains rose from its interior. Rivers ran from the highlands to the coast. Bays cut into the shoreline. He drew Antarctica as if the ice were simply not there. Antarctica would not be discovered for another 289 years, and the accuracy is what breaks the mind. Finet drew the continent at roughly 6,500 miles across. The true width is about 5,500, a stunning estimate for a landmass that, by every account, no one had measured. He placed mountain ranges where the transantarctic mountains actually run, dividing the continent east from west, a range not confirmed until the 20th century. He drew rivers flowing from the interior, which looked like pure fantasy until the seismic surveys of 1957 and 1958 found subglacial valleys in similar positions beneath the ice. He drew a great indentation that corresponds to the Ross Sea and the Ross Ice Shelf. There is a moment worth remembering here. In the winter of 1959, the historian Charles Hapgood was sitting in the reference room of the Library of Congress, surrounded by hundreds of old charts, when he turned a page and froze. Looking down at the southern hemisphere of Arronce-Finet's map, he later wrote, he had the instant conviction that he was looking at a genuine map of the real Antarctica. That single page is what launched the entire investigation that this list is built on. The official explanation reaches back to Aristotle. The ancient Greeks reasoned that a great southern continent had to exist to balance the lands of the north, and Finet merely illustrated that theory, with the mountains and rivers as decorative filler. But theory tells you that a continent might be there. It does not tell you where to put the transantarctic mountains. It does not lay river valleys over real subglacial channels. The decoration keeps coming out correct. And this is the moment the whole list snaps into focus, because Finet drew this in 1531, and he was not the first. 18 years earlier, an Ottoman admiral had drawn the same impossible ice-free continent, from sources he said were ancient. 2 men, 2 nations, 2 decades apart, drawing the same buried coastline neither could have seen. That is no longer a lucky guess, that is a copy, and a copy has an original. Number 1. The Piri-Reis Map, 1513. The year is 1513. You are sitting in a lamplit room in Constantinople, the Bosphorus gleaming outside the window, and on the table in front of you is a sheet of gazelle skin parchment carrying something that should not be possible. The coast of South America curves across the leather in confident lines. The western edge of Africa sits in perfect proportion, and at the bottom of the world you have drawn the northern coast of Antarctica, a frozen continent that will not be officially discovered for another 307 years. The map was found by accident. In 1929, during renovations at Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was cataloging documents when he came across a rolled fragment of gazelle skin, signed by Admiral Piri-Reis of the Ottoman Imperial Navy and dated to 1513. In his own notes on the parchment, Piri-Reis explained that he had compiled it from roughly 20 source charts, some, he claimed, dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and one that had belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. What stopped the historians cold was not the age, it was the accuracy. The Antarctic coastline on the Piri-Reis map matches the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, the shape of the rock beneath a mile-thick ice sheet, terrain that has not been visible for roughly 6,000 years, since before the end of the last ice age. In 1960, this stopped being a curiosity and became a problem for the United States Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer, an Air Force cartographer, compared the Piri-Reis map to seismic data gathered by a polar expedition that had probed the ice of Queen Maud Land in 1949. In an official letter, he confirmed that the map's coastline matched the seismic profile with remarkable accuracy, and stated plainly that the Air Force had no idea how the data on the map could be reconciled with what anyone was supposed to know in 1513. Later analysis reported a correlation of around 0.98 between the map's Antarctica and modern surveys, nearly perfect. These were military men with security clearances, treating it as a technical problem. They had no reason to want an impossible answer. They simply reported what the data showed. The mainstream explanation is that the Antarctic coast is really the coast of South America, distorted and bent southward, mistaken identity, amplified by believers who highlight the matches and ignore the errors elsewhere on the map. But when the map is reprojected using period-appropriate mathematics, the orientation does not fit South America. The river mouths, the ranges, the indentations of the coast align not with the continent above, but with Queen Maud Land beneath its ice. So where did an Ottoman admiral who never sailed to South America get a coastline no human eye had seen for 6,000 years? His notes point to ancient sources, charts from Alexander's age and older. Charles Hapgood, the man who had already found that same fingerprint on Oran's Feen, on Mercator, on the Aegean islands of Ibn Benzara, gathered it all into a book in 1966 called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. His argument was simple and staggering, that the Piri-Reis map was copied from far older material, drawn by an advanced maritime civilization during a time when Antarctica's coast was still free of ice. A lost global survey, Phoenician, or older still, whose charts survived through great libraries like Alexandria before fragmenting into the medieval cartography of Europe and Islam. Every other map on this list lives somewhere out there. In a Venetian attic, a Lisbon strongroom, the blank center of an ocean, a sail room, a thief walked out of. This one points somewhere worse. It points backward, past every civilization we have a name for, to people who sailed an ice-free Antarctica and mapped it with an accuracy we could not match until we fired shockwaves through the ice in the 20th century. And then they vanished, so completely, that nothing remains of them but a coastline copied and copied again, until it surfaced on a sheet of gazelle skin in Constantinople. And not one of the 20 source maps Piri-Reis swore he used has ever been found. We did not lose a map. We lost the people who drew it. We melted al-Idrisi's silver disc for scrap. We let a thief carry de Vergas into the dark. We burned the Latin books and forgot the names, and still, across 500 years and 24 maps, the same impossible sentence keeps surfacing through the parchment, in Korean and Arabic and Latin and Turkish, in the hand of monks and admirals and royal mathematicians who never met. Someone knew this world before we ever did. If you want to keep pulling at the thread, the video on screen now goes deeper, and make sure you subscribe.